Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to NEW302, the 26th of November, 2020, and the penultimate class of this semester, which means that as of next week, we will be hitting the halfway point, which is pretty remarkable, especially given the localized time distortions that have been, sweeping the last 9 months, 9, 10. See, I can't even tell. Sorry, just setting this thing. Okay, so there we go. A couple of things. One, I've said this before, but I'll say it again. Please do respond to your peers' discussion questions, partly because they need that feedback, ideally speaking, to write their post-presentation reflections, but just also partly because engaging is, part of your participation grade, but honestly, really, because it's just courteous, right? You want people to engage with it. And I presume it creates the cold hand of dread when people, do not engage with it and for whatever reason, right? Now, I suspect that for whatever reason is because you guys are absolutely buried under assignments and so on and so forth right now, and right coming into final exams, and I get that. But just take a couple minutes, make a comment, right? Just something. It's good for your participation grade, and try to do it in a reasonably timely fashion. I don't mind if people kind of come back and make comments later, but like there is a time limit after which, it's not that useful to the people who are writing their post-presentation reflections and called upon to speak to the engagement around that stuff. So if you could do that, that would be very nice of you, and also good for your grade. Okay, so that's thing one. Thing two. So there's a couple presentations this week, which should be posted up shortly. That might be a little later than usual. Some things came up, but I anticipate that they should be up this evening, possibly around the time that I am sort of meeting people online. I had 2 lecture chunks planned for today, but after reflection, I considered basically that I'm just going to do the one. I'm going to do one today. So I'm going to delay my Watchmen comments another week. My reason is it's just very clear that people are underwater. I hope that there are not, at this present moment, people sweatily hammering away on their papers, because for God's sakes, if you need an extension, just ask for one, really. But I imagine there are. And the fact is, if you're not sweatily on this, you're sweatily on something else. I get it. It's that time of year. So with an eye to that, given that there are a couple presentations, I'm going to keep myself within the boundaries of one meager, narrow hour. That's what I'm going to do. So, right. So, Watchmen, I will talk about next week. I do have a lot to say. The presentations were good, and of course the other resources that I put up to good, but there's so much here. So really deconstructing this, and then even that won't be exhaustive, but I think that there are some aspects that I can bring to bear and sort of foreground for you that may help put a bunch of this in perspective, and especially to connect it back around to the course material. The one thing I will say about it, just briefly, because it does relate into our theme today, and this is a piece of feedback that some of you have heard from me before, and I offer to some of you as feedback on your assignments. But very often when we are considering a particular piece of fiction, our tendency is, even when we're doing a Jungian depth psych style analysis, our tendency is to, isolate the protagonist and then think of them as a full person, right? And talk about their various traits and components. And that is definitely one way, okay, that you can think about characters in fiction when you're doing this kind of analysis, especially with relatively nuanced modern fiction, right? Sort of within the tradition of the novel, where the tradition of the novel pretty specifically, grounds itself in a certain kind of like inner life and psychology of the characters, right? Right back to sort of Bildungsroman, right, coming of age kinds of stories and this sort of thing. The idea is that the nuanced experience of the character and its the sort of the portrayal of its psychology is one of the things that really distinguishes the novel. But when we're looking at lots of texts, certainly many texts that fall within the iconic tradition, and definitely things like fairy tales. Although you can run that as a level of analysis, okay, and I always recommend that people attempt multiple levels of analysis to see what they can bring out of the text sort of in different ways. I often find that it is more fruitful with something that sort of impinges on the fairy tale side of things, to think of the characters in a fairy tale not as having psychology, but as being psychology. And what I mean by that is, when we consider something like The Wizard of Oz, we can dig in and think about, the inner workings of the Scarecrow's mind, or Batman Begins for that matter, the inner workings of the Scarecrow's mind. But it's often more useful to consider these things in terms of their like iconic and archetypal role as a kind of complex, right? So to sort of pick a stance, there doesn't even necessarily need to be an ego. Some stories do not possess an ego proxy, right? They are interactions of psychodynamic forces sort of beneath the surface, but without the ego present. That's rare. Most of the time, these stories tend to be of the kind of confrontation with the unconscious sort. So it's the ego wandering in sort of a space that we can interpret as being like a dreamlike space, right? And when we think about a dreamlike space in these terms, we consider the idea that the ego is immersed into its own dynamics, into the dynamics of the psyche, right? So that it's not that there is a message being received in a dream exactly, but rather that the ego, that the consciousness has dropped down into the field of the interactions which compose its larger being. Similarly, I think you can read most kind of fairy tales in that way more readily, right? Which also accounts for the fact that, frankly, fairy tale characters tend not to have a whole lot of psychological sophistication. Comic book characters, likewise, tend to be sketched in those kinds of terms, right? They're sketched in minimal terms. Now, certainly it is the case that they became more sophisticated in their psychology from the 70s onward, okay? And in many ways, this book speaks to that very directly and specifically. The characters obviously have psychologies, but there is a back and forth here between them having psychology and them being psychology. So that's sort of an important level to think about that stuff at. Okay, I'm gonna hold the rest of my comments because I specifically said I'm not doing a video on that this week. I want to, that's the thing. I want to. It's a book I've been teaching for many years. And I think there's a lot of interesting stuff to be said, but I'm not saying it now. I'm saying something else now. So the topic for this week is play and role play. Now, a number of you who have taken previous classes with me or have seen sort of talks that I've given and interviews that I've given and stuff know that this is an area of sort of significant interest and inquiry for me. And I specifically titled it Play and Role Play so that I can get both at the sort of general dynamics around play, importantly, which I think are really, really crucial, but also to touch on role play because that's an area of my specific interest and expertise. And I think that there's some really illustrative stuff there. Those of you that are very familiar with my stuff are going to be familiar with some of these examples and ideas, but bear with me. I may talk about some aspect of it. So if you're interested, please stay on. Okay, so play. So what can we say about play? A lot of my thinking around play comes from a few different sources. Certainly there are Jungian influences on it, and we will come back around to those because they're sort of specifically impactful of the material that we're looking at. But a couple of theorists, or a few theorists, who I think of in this respect. Okay. Obviously, I think of the developmental psychologists, so I think of sort of Piaget and Vygotsky. There are other developmental psychologists that are interesting, but those two have a really significant impact, Vygotsky especially, looking at play. So that's a consideration in this. I think about Michael Apter, who has a whole set of sort of theoretical elaborations around what he calls reversal theory. And reversal theory integrates with play in a bunch of sort of different and interesting ways. I think to some extent about the effective neuroscience work of Jakob Henksepp, who I've already mentioned. So this is a guy who had a career as an owl tickler, which you can go look up on YouTube, and I encourage you to do so, but also did a lot of work around mapping neuroaffective circuitry. So he did some really specific work around that, and one of his sort of core circuits that he delineates is the play circuit, and that's been quite influential. And then obviously there's a fair bit of stuff around my own experience and integration with play, which we'll touch on when we get to sort of the role play section. So looking at play, one of the things that we see is that play is this really common, and one thinks of it primarily as mammalian kind of learning response thing, right? Kittens and puppies play. It's one of the reasons we like them, is that they are sort of that playful, jokey, right? They joke, stalk each other, and do this sort of thing. And of course, we think of kids as playing. And play is a really peculiar space. In some cases, it's sort of imitative, highly imitative. Playing house, playing house, playing sort of making tea, that kind of thing, like having a tea thing, dollhouses, action figures, all the various kinds of imaginative games that get combined with physical activities. So a good friend of mine who grew up in the country used to talk about how, he didn't have the most up-to-date toys when he was a kid, but it didn't matter, because up until the age he was 10, he was totally happy to find an interestingly shaped stick and pretend it was a gun sword. And right, there's something to that. Something which I add, that I think the rise of specific electronic devices for children, things that are filled with single-purpose chips, does a lot to impede that. So I'm actually a big fan of more free-form toys and things. But the thing is, play and the imagination will tend to let fly regardless. The intended purpose of a toy in a play space is not always the imaginative purpose that it ends up having, which is why most of the people I know who, say, played with Barbies as a kid had at least one sort of mutilated Barbie. A thing that always fascinated and slightly horrified me as a kid. The idea of mutilating my toys had not occurred to me. But there's something going on there, right? That clearly is not quite what Mattel had in mind. So, in the way that the expression goes, right, the street finds its own uses, so does the toy room find its own uses for things. Nevertheless, right, there is this space within play, as we see within developmental psychology, and a big part of it is localized in what I've talked about before, that I call the as not function. Okay, and this as not, this sort of a thing that is paradoxically itself and not itself, is really central to play. It is, in fact, the core thing with play. So, examples I've already used. Tickling, right? As I pointed out, tickling is a phenomenon which requires comfort. Somebody jumps out of an alley towards you and grabs your ribs. You don't experience it as tickling. You experience it as an attack. It's contextual. And the way in which it's contextual is that it is an attack, but it's not an attack. It feels kind of bad and threatening, but kind of good, right? It's intrinsically got this paradoxical aspect to it. Likewise, most forms of make-believe, right? Kids often have a blurry and nuanced boundary between themselves and the personalities of their toys, right? But usually, if you talk to a kid about it, it's like, they'll be like, no, like, it's just a doll, it's not real. Now, who knows how much of that is conscious, because also kids will tell you that they know a horror movie isn't real, but then they will be, scared to death come nightfall of whatever it is. And that's not just limited to kids. I get reports from adults fairly regularly about having seen some particularly frightening film which led them being like on edge as they walked home, right? Not that they literally believed at some level that they were going to get attacked, but at some other level they really clearly did. Like, they were frightened and nervous and set off, right? So there's that as not quality to play, right? When we play with like tiny things in a dollhouse, and I own quite a bit of doll furniture. I got into miniatures, right? And I got into fantasy miniatures not very long ago, 4 years ago. Yeah, it started with one game with me collecting a few army men and then exploded. And I got sort of deeply into miniatures, which I had never really been interested in. I couldn't afford them when I was younger. So I just played with my imagination when I was playing sort of role-playing games and things. But I've gotten deeply interested in miniatures. And consequently, because I'm always setting up tiny scenes and things, right? I've also periodically bought various kinds of doll furniture, and where it's like these tiny little chairs and tiny little phonographs and tiny little breadboards and whatever, right? You can buy an astoundingly wide range of these things. So they have a quality to them, which is also this as not quality, right? They're marvelous in their verisimilitude, the extent to which they simulate. You hear this in Marwin Call when Hogenkamp pulls the gun out and he says, look, it really comes out and it's got a moving slide in it, right? That's an aspect and a quality of that kind of as not, which is like, it's a tiny version, like it's real. It's like real, right? Is the sort of thing that people say, it's got moving parts and so on and so forth. So there's that as not quality that's built in play. Now, I've already pointed out in other places that as not quality is something that actually extends really liberally through the other functions of play, not least things like metaphor, right? Metaphor intrinsically leans on as not, right? Every once in a while, fiction will come up with a character who, somewhat unrealistically, to be honest, given what we know about cognition, but won't understand metaphor, understands everything literally. In some cases, this is for comedic effect on figures of speech. Mostly it's for comedic effect as, somebody uses a metaphor and they take that literally, right? Now that's unrealistic because so far as we can tell, analogical thinking is one of the most fundamental functional properties in cognition. It's one of the things that mind does, and understandably so, because without sort of analogical smearing, right? Every unique individual would form its own category, kind of thing. Nevertheless, that as not property in metaphor, right? So right? Tim is a pig, as we talked about, right? Likewise, it has that it is and it isn't. The same thing runs through humor. Same thing runs in many cases through symbolism and different kinds of storytelling, thematic storytelling. Like the thing is that as not property of things, which comes out of the basic as not of play, right? Deeply informs the sort of entire set of techniques and things, frankly, that we use to maneuver around in consciousness. And when we're talking about depth psychological work, right? Those techniques, those levers, right, are sort of essential to the work. And as you can see, right, I mean, you can go through a variety of the different kinds of depth psychological techniques, and you think about things like, the transjectivity of dream interpretation, okay? And transjectivity is sort of by its very nature as not, right? It points to the specific and concrete object, but it also points inwards towards a dynamic. It is itself and it's not itself, right? Symbolism, of course, necessarily has to be approached in that way, generally speaking. Lots of the sort of modes that Jung talks about, right? Building his little house, right? Building the little house. And then the much bigger version, frankly, of building a castle and, playing sort of medieval alchemist in his lakeside castle. Sand play, which is an extension of this kind of dollhouse work. Active imagination, frankly, very often leans on these same capacities. Okay, so we know that it's central within play, right, on the developmental psych side. Michael Apter's work, which I would encourage people to look at, has to do with construal specifically. So the way that things are sort of interpreted by context. As a very simple example, I'll refer you to the classic experiment. So what you do is you have a group of Confederates, and I have some methodological problems with the use of Confederates deception, basically, in psychological experimental design. But we don't have time to get into those here. Nevertheless, okay, I have some issues with it, but the basic design is, You give somebody a shot of norepinephrine, adrenaline. You give them a shot of adrenaline, right? And then you have a group of Confederates, grad students who are deceivers or actors, who pretend either to be in a highly fearful state. They pretend that they've also gotten the shot. So they pretend to be in a highly fearful state, or they pretend to be in a highly excited state. And what you see, of course, is the interpretation of the specific context configures how people interpret the somatic event, right? So they're experiencing a set of bodily things, but how those things get interpreted, if they're with the excited group, they too become excited and excitable. If they're with the fearful group, they too become fearful, right? Specific interpretation contextually. Likewise, you can do this right at the sensory level. If you take butyric acid, I think, and you waft it under somebody's nose and you tell them, you're smelling of fine cheese, right? They'll go, fine cheese. If you take the same chemical, and cultural backgrounds aside, because obviously there are cultures that don't find fine cheese, and persons obviously who don't find fine cheese an especially pleasant experience, but you can take the same chemical, butyric acid, wave it under somebody's nose and say, vomit. And people will start gagging. So in one case, they're like, give me some. And in the other, they're right, having an involuntary disgust response. And that's context, it's interpretation. Apter's work extends a little bit past that, well, actually quite a bit past that, to be honest, and has to do with the broader implications of these kinds of activations, and it relates to things like flow. But he also talks significantly about this as not. He in fact has a chapter in the book Reversal Theory about dolls and doll furniture and doll houses, which I stumbled across weirdly right as I was kind of maximally interested in the theory of this stuff a few years ago. So Apter, just give me sources in case you want to chase this stuff down a bit. Right. Vygotsky, who I already mentioned, of course, also is a source for internalization, which I mentioned that before, and the idea of play as a way of internalizing behavior, and we're going to come to that, and internalizing identity states, which I'll come to also, practicing skills too, which we'll get to as well. And then, gosh, what was the last? Oh, right, yeah, Jaak Panksepp. So Panksepp's model is a 7 or 8 circuit model, okay? And he designates the components of this model in all caps, which is a questionable editorial decision, but okay. So he has a number of these circuits: rage, care, seeking, etc. One of these circuits is play. And he identifies it because he sees it as a sort of a common circuit through the mammal world. I think there's very good evidence that it occurs in birds as well. It's not clear to me that it occurs in reptiles, although, as I've mentioned before, I am continuously surprised the more instances of animal cognition I encounter. And very frequently I have my assumptions overturned in favor of a more complex assessment of what kinds of cognition animals are experiencing. But nevertheless, it's very clear that it occurs through the mammal world. And again, it's why we pretty much, aside from just their cuteness, right, which is about big eyes and floppiness, but it's why we like things like, kittens and puppies. They're playful. Sometimes it's annoying. They chew up our stuff, they bite our feet while we're trying to sleep and whatever. But a lot of the time, frankly, we find it kind of endearing. It's playful. Okay, so he identifies this sort of play circuit. So if you're looking to track down extra stuff on sort of play as it's grounded in sort of the neurocircuitry, right? The effective neurocircuitry of the human brain, if you want to take things in that direction, I would encourage you to go track down Jaak Panksepp. Jaak, I think it's just Jack. Jack? It's 2 A's in the middle. Panksepp, anyway. Also, while you're looking at a stuff, go watch them tickle owls and mice. It's immensely endearing. They have a little hypersonic squeaks. Ultrasonic squeaks. Okay, so play. Now, some of the examples that we've already touched on get at some level to the fundamental utility of play for depth work, okay? So one thing about play is that it's as not. And this allows a certain kind of distancing. Lots of forms of active imagination at work are processes by which you externalize psychological contents in order to be able to work with them without them being quite so radioactive to you. And what do I mean by that? Trying to roll, different sort of psychological forces and dynamics around in your head is doable, right? You can do it. But frankly, it's so easy to get pushed around and entangled in them. It's very difficult to sort of see them with any kind of objectivity when you're just working up here. So lots of techniques seek to specifically to externalize your psychology. In a way, therapy itself is a kind of reflective externalization, right? There's another person there to coax the process and guide the process and whatever, push back in some cases. But a lot of it has to do with this externalization. You're saying things, but how they're coming back to you. One of the most basic techniques there is, right, is empathic reflection, in which what you're basically doing is just acknowledging with a slight restatement what it is that the person has said and cutting through to the underlying emotion, right? And it's a specific kind of reflection, but the point is it allows an externalization. And very often people's reaction to hearing something said to them, right, if they're like, comes back at them, right, is very different than what it feels like when it's on the inside. Likewise, sand play is an externalization. Most active imagination techniques are an externalization. And dream, in a certain way, is a kind of externalization too, right? In a way, insofar as we are somewhat disembedded from these regular processes, or maybe more sunk into them. In any event, we're having a different kind of encounter with our psychology than we normally have. And it's that ability to see forces in our own mind as though they were things outside of ourselves that carries a great deal of the power of doing dream work, right? Because you can see your dynamics, right, in a way that you can't normally. It's like all of a sudden the complex dream that you're having involving a genie, full disclosure, that was a dream I had last week, right? Suddenly it's clothed in these externalizing terms that really, really makes it starkly apparent, right, what's going on in that particular dynamic. And it's in a sense, it is separated from you. So your ego shrinks in the dream space, because it does. We know that sort of conscious capacity sharply shrinks within dream, even lucid dream relative to regular waking. So the conscious capacity shrinks, but what remains is then witness to things that are, right, playing out, some of which would have been tightly integrated and some of which would have been background processes. But the point is, it sets the aspects of the mind, right, outside and in front. So it's this externalization. Further, right, play allows for a kind of trying on of things, right? This is one of Vygotsky's points about play and sort of the developmental psych point of play, which is that playing at things lets us make attempts. It lets us try things on, right? We play with it first. This is kind of a fake it till you make it sort of thing. And unfortunately, this form of play becomes, like boringly and deadly serious in adulthood, when people forget that, frankly, for the most part, they are sort of playing at the world. Like everybody is kind of just playing these parts, right? And doing what they think is appropriate to the circumstance, and mostly sort of stumbling forward at high speed, trying not to get caught out for the fact that they don't know what they're doing. So that's an exaggeration, obviously, for rhetorical effect, but I think you take my point. The point is that rather, right, people get deadly serious about stuff, but in fact, play is an operative space that we use for growth. So, frankly, if you train as a doctor, initially speaking, you may have the information, but you're playing at being a doctor. And the thing is, people know it. That's why imposter syndrome is linked with, in Vygotsky's term, the zone of proximal development, right? Our growth, right? As we grow, we are necessarily moving beyond our set capacities. Moving beyond our set capacities basically means we are acting like the thing that we wish to become, right? We are pretending to be it, right? And the imposter syndrome comes about because we at some level know that we are not yet that, right? We're not that yet. I said the same thing two different ways. So play in that sense is sort of integral to the process of becoming. And you can see it also in lots of the suggestions that I've made specifically around the kind of work one can do around things like persona and shadow and contrasexual soul image, right? That taking on sort of roles and aspects and things, right? Playing with one's own expressive identity is often a way of bringing some aspect or connection of that into us, right? We put it on, right? We don it. You can see this really dramatically exemplified in some of the texts we've looked at, right? There's a reason I chose Batman Begins and Black Swan, where characters, again, are sort of, in Batman Begins, they are sort of vying to assume the archetype. And of course, quite literally, right, Bruce, puts it on in the end. And likewise, they are sort of vying for certain parts, certain sort of aspects, right? Vying to assume certain aspects of the archetype in Black Swan 2. And of course, the question of putting it on versus being possessed by it is central to both texts. So there's this fake it till you make it play space. This, incidentally, and we probably don't have time to go too far down this rabbit hole, but we're going to talk about it more later, is also deeply, deeply central, not just to the kind of imaginal exercise work that's central to sort of active imagination and depth psychology, and other schools of psychology and psychodynamic psychology more generally, right? So drama therapies and narrative therapies and this sort of thing. But also, it's exceptionally central to other kinds of practices of intentional development, right? So, one that I have a lot of familiarity with sort of ritual esoteric systems. And, so in some cases, right, magical practice. And magical practice leans in many traditions super explicitly on exactly this kind of thing. You can see it in sort of the shamanic roots of things, right, where sort of costuming and acting a part and so on and so forth become a central part of expressing an aspect out, right? Masks, makeup, costuming, dramatic presentation, etc., right? Storytelling is often among sort of the primary skills of the shaman, but also a particular kind of embodied acting. Likewise, okay, you can see it sort of more formally and abstractly presented within magical systems, where magical practitioners often seek to achieve things through interpretive acts of imagination in some cases, but also through sort of clothing themselves in that imagination. So lots of, a fairly contemporary interpretation has it that most of the scaffolding within a sort of magical ritual setting is designed to sort of create a suspension of disbelief. It's designed to get you into it, right? It's cosplay, basically, right? Some of it has a more sophisticated symbolic ritual machinery attached to it, but a lot of it is like the magician's robes go on and you hold the bell, book, and candle, and you do that because it makes you feel magic-y, right? Which is an important part of easing yourself into the space. But likewise, there are lots of practices that we see which essentially revolve around sort of imagining yourself as, for instance, a particular divine figure, God or spirit, right? So the idea is, when you imagine your astral light body as changing to the god Ra, the sun god Ra, right? And now you are Ra, luminous Ra. You're performing an act of play. You're looking to inhabit that space, but very deliberately in an as not fashion. Now, you really want to talk yourself into it, as you do with lots of play. Play often functions best when you can move really thoroughly into it, right? In the same way that drama, right, as I pointed out. And, I gave the example of Shakespeare at the Park. It's like nobody is mistaking that for reality, but it can be deeply, deeply absorbing. However, if you sit there going, this isn't real, this isn't real, this isn't real, or if things remind you of that, right? If there's a break in the verisimilitude of the performance, you're not getting it anymore, right? It's no longer, you're not getting the effect anymore. So the aspects of it that are sort of functional in a psychological sense break for you if you don't have absorption. Absorption being a variable trait, right? Propensity to absorption is a bell curve psychological distribution through the population. But the point is, in general, right? You need to be able to sort of get into it. Same with play. You have to be able to get into it. And in some cases, right, you don't even see things like this, like, sport, for instance, right? If you're playing tennis against somebody, you're thinking about this as a state of play. And the state of play, of course, is believing that what happens on the tennis court matters. at all. In what way is it relevant, right? You will occasionally get people who will have that response to sports. Why does this matter? Like, what is this supposed to do? And of course, you can absorb it as like, well, it's for its own sake. It's a kind of, you know, like movement and prediction and all these things, right? But there is always a subset of that that's like, oh yes, and also it's a proxy for fighting, right? We're having a competition. It's a proxy for fighting. So yeah, again, that's sort of something where the game aspect, the play aspect of it is sort of closer to the physical aspect, but even still you can see, right, there's an easy thing to break from in the as not function if you're not sort of absorbed. And certainly for fiction, and certainly for all kinds of sort of imaginative play. If you're constantly, you know, raising the question, this isn't real, this isn't real, this isn't real, typically you're going to lose the sort of function that has. Okay. Play is associated with a number of figures in the psyche. And I would say that probably most closely from a Jungian perspective, it's associated with the paradoxical figure of Mercurius, son of God and the devil, right? A kind of emanated self-image that contains within it the sort of hermaphroditic paradox. So it is neither good nor evil, neither male nor female, right? And sort of neither fully part of the mortal realm nor fully part of sort of the realm of the self, right? Paradoxical figure. If you have read those issues of Rare But Fiends, they contain a fairly lengthy kind of exposition on Mercurius specifically, which is one of the figures that sort of tends to signpost certain aspects of dream work, and especially alchemical dream work, is that you start to encounter this sort of figure. It's not Mercurius week, so I'm not going to get into that deeply, although you will notice that a couple of the readings for today touch up against some of this stuff, but I'm going to save some of that actually for next week in part. However, that play space is just sort of in general operation, right, in so much of the work. So talking about that play space, the externalization of psychic content, and the as not function and its relationship to things like active imagination gives me a fairly natural segue to talk about role-playing. Now, obviously, there is role-playing in the sense of like the persona, right, is role-playing. And there's role-playing in the sense of just like acting, right? Like learning to play a role. And we've talked about how those things have a very specific and natural relationship between them, right? Persona at the outset very often is just acting. It's just acting. You're just acting the way that you think you're supposed to act. However, role-playing also, you know, connote some specific sets of games. Now, in some cases, people may be thinking of role-playing games as being sort of like computer video role-playing games. That's not what I mean, for a number of reasons. I'm talking about so-called tabletop role-playing games. I'm old enough that when I grew up, that was the only kind there were. So they were just called role-playing games. Now it is the case that, of course, there's an enormous market for, you know, video games that are role-playing games. I think the choice structure and stuff within computerized role-playing games is still woefully thin and sort of not very nuanced. So I think they're, in many cases, they're just sort of glorified choose your own adventures, you know, like forced path narratives, which is a thing, but it's not role-playing in the opener and more playful sense that I mean here. I'm talking about tabletop role-playing games. The, you know, greatest example, at least the best known example, is Dungeons and Dragons. Okay, so these are games where you are collectively telling a story, and where, generally speaking, there is one player who is a kind of judge, who oversees the rules and describes the events, often is responsible for sort of the planning of the challenges and so on and so forth, and the story, the background story. And then each player, generally speaking, each other player is playing a single character who is deemed to be a kind of protagonist, right? And usually these things, of course, follow some kind of team structure, just because you typically play them in groups. They're very effortful. You can play one-on-one, and it's an intense experience if you do and you know what you're doing. But generally speaking, they're played in groups, and so you get a kind of, right, Fellowship of the Ring or Avengers or Buffy, or right, you get this kind of 5-man band structure where people are taking up different dynamic roles and they are working together to accomplish certain kinds of goals within the framework of the story. What's interesting about them, from my perspective, I mean, there are a lot of things that are interesting about them from my perspective, obviously, but in this context, it's really interesting to talk about role play as a very natural space where people's psychological contents tend to get projected. And that can happen consciously and it can happen unconsciously, okay? So I certainly have had a number of experiences where something that was an extremely powerful emotional experience for me in a role-playing game, when I was playing a game, only later, often years later, became evident to me as a kind of symbolic version of the very issues that I was dealing with in my life. And often I didn't see that, right? Like I would be playing through something. Those realizations on my part, in turn, led me into sometimes a considerably closer analysis of the sorts of repeated themes that I find in my players' games, you know, especially as I've gone on professionally, as like ever a therapist. So, you know, I had a long-term player who went through a phase, mostly in sort of fantasy games like Dungeons and Dragons, but also in modern games of different sorts. But he went through a very long phase where he always played somebody who was huge. So in a fantasy setting, he would be a literal giant, you know, 12 feet tall, this kind of thing. In a more grounded modernist setting, he would be, well, the equivalent to a giant. He would play a character who was 7 feet tall and 400 pounds. There are not that many 7-foot tall persons out there. Like those are a rare commodity in the outer world. So he played a whole series of these characters who were, like over a long period of time, who were all sort of in a large part, not exclusively, they were often smart too, which was interesting. They were smart but big, and so got mistaken because they were big for being dumb. But they would be smart but big. And he sort of repeated this theme enough times and seemed to be emphasizing their bigness as a part of their thing. And it, you know, obviously it got me to wondering. Now, I was running those games for the most part. And so I got to see this turn up a bunch of times. And it wasn't something that I discussed with him, but it was something that, well, I decided to experiment a bit with narratively. So what I did was I ran a game, essentially speaking, where he got to play, you know, this giant character. And then I introduced a mechanical system into the game such that as his character gained in experience, as his character sort of went up in levels, right? So as his character advanced over the years and years that we played this, the character also got bigger. So the character kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. And there was at least one really significant milestone in the game where the character obtained a helm which had belonged to his half-brother, who was also a giant. And this immediately doubled him in size, right? This character was a shadow analog. So I constructed this thing where by the very end of this game, the character was 50 feet tall, right? Which is, what is that, like 18 meters? It's tall. It's really huge. The character was preposterously huge. Now, in some cases, that actually, you know, led to problems. Like, you know, he couldn't go into a regular tavern and stuff. They'd never get like a bed for him, anything like that, right? But in other ways, right, I let it push out to its logical conclusion and let him play a truly enormous character. And for whatever reason, that scratched the edge. He hasn't played characters like that since. And has expressly mentioned it when I've said things. He's like, no, I got that out of my system. What did he get out of his system is the question. Now, I don't want to, I mean, you don't know this person, right? And I don't really want to do a running analysis on my friend. But the thing is that there is something that's being symbolically expressed there that wanted to be worked out over and over and over again around bigness, right? And around being kind of like a protective giant. There's something really specifically being projected and worked out there. And one wonders to what extent he noticed it. Okay, another example. There was a student, which I had when I taught high school and I ran the gaming club at the high school, who was a difficult student. He came to the school at 16, and he had been having a fair number of behavioral problems, and he was a prickly kid, to be honest. He could be quite sharp and nasty, and he had a bunch of things going on. And the fact is that a lot of the other teachers didn't like him. Basically, they thought he was excessively difficult and rude and kind of nasty. And he just wasn't connecting with his classes at all. So they gave him to me, because they often, these kinds of cases where there was sort of school refusal, or where a kid kind of couldn't or wouldn't connect with the material at all, basically was where there was a strong emotional subcomponent. Very often I ended up teaching those cases. And I like doing that, to be honest. So I got this kid, and as one of the young man, I got him. And one of the things that I sort of roped him into doing the work with was, I knew he was really into games, and he was really into history, military history. And so I got him into gaming. And specifically, I started doing some gaming with him, and then I brought him into the school gaming group. So I makes a character up for this group. And at one point, a bunch of the other teachers are kind of talking, and they're talking about basically that this kid is nasty, that he's a prick, that they don't like him, right? And I heard a couple people make sort of fairly specific comments about his personality and about where he might be going, right? Like what the future might hold for him, or what he'd be turning into, or whatever. And I felt a pretty strong need to pipe up, because I was like, well, that doesn't seem like this kid at all. I mean, yeah, that's certainly superficially, you might get that impression, but that's not who that's not who this young man is. And so I said, like, I don't think so. And they were like, well, why? And I said, well, okay, do you know what he plays in Dungeons and Dragons? And they were like, no. And I was like, okay, so in Dungeons and Dragons, he plays a paladin, a holy knight, okay, who is an armored defender of justice in the weak. Now, he's got a slightly high opinion of himself, this character, but also he routinely steps up to defend the weak and innocent and the powerless. He puts himself in harm's way, and he adheres really closely to the concepts of justice and honor, and right? I said, that's who this young man, that's who he wants to be. Given the choice to be anybody, because your options are pretty broad at the table, right? When you want to make up a character, you can play all kinds of different things. People do. And that's who he decided to be. He decided to be sort of a defender of justice in the weak, really this upstanding, noble, good champion character. I said, that's who he wants to be. I said, and the thing is, why is he doing this external prickly thing? Well, he's doing this external prickly thing because, like all of us, he's screwed up in different ways. But he's also thinking that this is how he should behave. It's the best thing he's come up with, right? He's not doing it to, like, intrinsically aggravate you or something. It's just like, this is how he has figured out how to navigate the problems of the social world in day to day, right? And some of that's defensive, and some of it is based on his past history, and some of it, there's all kinds of things. But like, he's come to this conclusion based on his past. But this isn't what he wants to do. What he wants to do is this. And what we should be doing is both looking to that, but facilitating it, like give him opportunities, right? Sometimes that's a thing. You have to sort of give people opportunities to be heroes. And one of the things that I like about role-playing games specifically is that, for many people, lack of opportunity, or just, frankly, fear, are going to end up being one of the factors that keep you from doing things. He could probably develop this aspect of his personality to some extent by becoming a fireman, right? If he worked as a fireman, he would be able to save the innocent and wage a never-ending war against fire, right? He would get to beef up. It would be a kind of on-call, high tension, high excitement. It's heroic, right? People think firemen are heroic, and rightly so. He could do that, right? But it asks a lot. It asks a lot in terms of physical discipline. It asks a lot in terms of risk. It's the kind of thing that might cause fear, and frankly, it doesn't pay that well. I know a bunch of firemen. Doesn't pay that well. Doesn't pay badly, especially if you're provincial, like but like if you're with the ministry. But nobody's getting rich being a fireman. So, like there are sort of disincentives in a way to acting in that space. But at the table, right, to the extent that you were able to immerse yourself, and a good game is deeply immersive. It pulls your emotions in a way that no other art form does, in my experience, bar none. Far more so than film, far more so than a novel, far more so than theater, vastly more so than a video game. The fact is that there's such a close identification, right, between your own state of agency and what happens with the character that I think basically your brain sort of virtually extends as per the kind of natural born cyborg hypothesis. So, your mind basically just extends to this thing and then it becomes deadly serious, quite real. Now, you can step away from it, although sometimes the emotions of those things, right, are striking. I have been at more than one game where the death of a character, and sometimes not even a player character, but often a player character, the death of somebody's character who has been a fixture at the table for a number of years and who everybody has like memories with, that shuts the game down for the night. Now, it typically doesn't shut the actual game down, but what happens is that whatever aspect of like, we're out to, play an adventure where we, swing over pits of lava and fight orcs, instead becomes this elegiac funeral. People will throw a funeral. People will break out good liquor. I've been present for that, where somebody died and people just like broke out like the good scotch as though somebody had died, right? And basically we'll have a wake. And this isn't something that's like a convention, like this is known. It happens spontaneously as a sense of people's feelings. It's like they don't want to keep going. They want to pause, right? So they want to pause and they want to reflect and they want to honor. It's a lot, frankly, like being at an actual wake or an actual funeral, which is quite striking. People can have very strong feelings. People that don't have good general psychological containment can have really strong identification, really strong feelings. So this is the point that I make, which is like back in the 80s, D&D and role-playing games got accused of being tangled up with Satanism, which they are not, but also of, whatever, driving people crazy. Now, I don't think that that's true by and large, but I do think that it is the case that certainly for people who have a degree of instability, right, for whatever reason, so they have a big hole in the meaning of their life or not a lot to attach to that's good in their life, they can get massively overinvested, and occasionally that can cause a kind of almost Marwin Call-esque breakdown in terms of their priorities and the importance. These are the cases that you hear of where somebody's character dies and they lose it. Like they lose it. They'll threaten the dungeon master's life or this kind of thing. That stuff happens sometimes. It does. Not to scare you off from the hobby, it's rare. But it does happen, okay? That, people who have very porous sort of psychic boundaries find themselves caught up in the dynamics in a way that, sort of supersedes, whatever sort of rational distinction they might have had in place. Okay, so it's the case that this level of immersion and involvement can be quite transformative. Now, very few games, I add, are designed off the shelf to deliberately achieve these things, right? So it's not the case in a certain sense, right? Like when I'm talking about this young man, this young man could get his, like heroic whatever by becoming a fireman, or he can simulate it at the table. And the thing is that he gets a similar sense of risk because there really does feel like there's something on the line. Your heart pounds, right? Because you're invested. He can simulate it. And when he simulates it, he gets to also simulate the feeling and the response. As an interesting example, okay? I was immediately before the pandemic had just ramped up a research project which involved role-playing with autism spectrum young adults, so kind of 18 to 30. And the idea was that it was a good framework for sort of social interaction, right? Which has some scaffolding, because regular social interaction has a lot of unspoken codes and stuff that are hard to track, whereas role-playing has sort of rules, right? It's like, now it's your turn to speak, and now it's your turn to speak, and now it's your turn to speak, and there are conventions at the table. The world in question is more categorically constrained. It has less of the ambiguity and confusion that exists in the world, but similarly, you can play with it in interesting ways because of those conventions, okay? So as an interesting example, you can take somebody who is exceptionally shy, for instance, somebody who's extremely shy, and coax them into a position. So imagine that they're giving a speech where they're trying to rally villagers to the defense of their village, right? An evil horde is on the march, or dragon or something, and they're like, we have to defend your homes, okay? So you could put the player in the position of like trying to persuade them. And there's some ways of doing that. Of course, you can just get them to roll a die, and that's not a very interesting way of handling it. Instead, you can get them to like give a rallying speech, right? Say something inspirational. Now, for people who have difficulty in this area, you might get something, especially if they also, right, have a lot of social anxiety, right? You might get something as simple as like, okay, like, go get them, guys, right? But here's the trick. You can then have, within the fictional universe, the crowds of villagers or whatever roar with approval. And the person you will watch, the person will have the suffusing sense of, right, success at the task, which means that you can basically mold their sense and propensity for it. You can, of course, reward people with fantastic virtual goods, right? Have 10,000 experience points, right? This means nothing in the real world. You can't take that experience and go buy something with it, but it means something within the context of the world. And therefore, you can emphasize certain things. When people take these sort of developmental risks, as it were, you can reward them in this really powerful, immersive way and allow them to simulate those kinds of behaviors. Now, that's just on sort of the overt side, if you will, the cognitive behavioral side. Where it gets really interesting is when you're talking about working with their inner material, okay? So, as I said, there is no role-playing game that I'm aware of which explicitly seeks to do this, right? And frankly, with good reason, maybe. It does verge on the edge of being therapy, being a therapeutic technique. Nevertheless, if you have, a well-integrated group that trusts each other and stuff, there are definitely some things that you can do in these games that punch things up pretty dramatically, okay, in terms of how they impact people. So one of the things that I have done for many years is, I pay attention, obviously, to the psychology of the characters, right? So this is the sort of stated character as sketched, Sherlock Holmes is arch-rational and short-tempered, got it, right? But I also pay fairly close attention to the psychology of the players. I pay relatively close attention to the way that they interact with the game, that is to say, like what they come to the table to do. But I also am occasionally mindful of how the kinds of character traits that they're choosing are expressions in one way or another of their own concerns and their own material, right? And then I push on those things on purpose, which is to say I bring up aspects and themes. Now, in a way, that's just art, right? It's like I'm connecting through to something, but it has a very special quality and property when it's done within the role-playing game. If you know what you're doing, and I dare say I do, at least on the Dungeon Master side. I mean, to be perfectly frank, I've probably spent more time in terms of skill building. If you want to talk about the 10,000 hours of expertise, I probably spent more time doing role playing over the course of my life than I have almost any other activity. And it's probably something that I have in some ways the most expertise in, despite the fact that I think I'm no slouch, obviously, in other areas. So in many ways, my material around this area exists at an intersection point of my relatively specific kind of interests and skills, right? Depth psych, conventional cognitive science, right? Depth psych, conventional cognitive science, practical therapeutic work, storytelling, and role-playing. And I tend to, not all the time, because sometimes people just want popcorn, but I tend to, oh, I need a little bit more time. I only got 16 seconds. I won't do it. I'll stop the clock, but I swear I won't talk too much longer. I like to occasionally do things that very specifically push on these questions. And by push on, I mean create dramatic conditions whereby the player operating the character has the ability to address the dramatic premise which is present within the trait that they've chosen. These create typically extremely powerful experiences for people. Like, done right, you can create a really powerful, lasting emotional moment for people. And in fact, done, sort of just so, you can use it to affect certain kinds of transformation. So I was going to tell you guys at greater length the story of the Black Buddha, because I don't think I've related that one. Okay, tell you what I will do is, if you go to, I guess you could go to my YouTube page because I have it in there too. But if you go to Tim Adelin's Voicecraft, I detail this whole experience in the first part of my solo interview with him. Maybe I'll put a link in. If you are interested in this stuff to that length, you can listen to me talk about this Black Buddha experience. And the Black Buddha is kind of comparable. Some of you also heard a little bit. So maybe I'll talk about this, about a monster which I created last year. So there was a contest, okay, which was open to gather monsters for a Dungeons and Dragons book. So this is meant to be monsters. And so I decided I was going to submit something competitively. And I sat down, and I frankly was not in a very good place. And so I sat down and sort of without really thinking about it, I suddenly came up with this monster called the Gelding Gloom. And the Gelding Gloom is this kind of like hung-headed, emaciated horse that plods around at a relatively constant speed, just wanders the roads, right, surrounded by sleet and rain. But the thing about the Gelding Gloom is it's as a foe, if you were to close with it, right, like, attack it, it would not be terribly dangerous per se. But it emanates waves of ennui and apathy. So you can tell it's been through a village because you'll find that everybody just like gave up, laid down, and died, right? They just like gave up. And that's its thing. It drains you. If you do get in close to it, it can suck you into the mud. So there's like thick mud. It creates, like all the rain creates mud on the roads, and it can suck you into the mud. And it can sort of age you and stuff. If it gets close, it can shriek and age you. Okay, so what is this thing? It's depression. It's just a depression monster. The point is that this depression monster, right, coding in this way, right, came to me immediately and spontaneously. But if you had players and you played through this thing to its sort of full dramatic logical consequence, you would essentially be allowing people to symbolically and ritually defeat depression and ennui. If you can imagine the kind of story that you might tell around that and how that could link in to the issues within people's lives, both the regular players and the judge, the dungeon master themselves, game master themselves, you can see how the kind of like scaffolded, right, rule scaffolded active imagination in a role-playing game is an exceptionally sort of powerful and versatile tool, okay? So I've used it in a bunch of ways, kind of therapeutically, which I'll probably talk about in the future as we go. And I have long been in the process of trying to very specifically delineate the theory around this, because there isn't much, frankly. So I've been, working on it for a few years and developing a kind of coherent through line theory around it with an eye towards eventually sharpening the specifics of practice, sort of in that space. So that's something we'll probably talk about more as we go. Yes, the very last thing I will say, and I will break because I'm already over an hour, but the very last thing I'll say, one extended link, which we will talk about, okay, is that there is a process of externalization of psychological contents, which is central, okay, to the Jungian interpretation of alchemy. That alchemy, in an important sense, provides a physical substrate of transformations upon which we project our unconscious contents, and thereby, by manipulating those contents outside of ourselves, we're able to effect psychological change inside of ourselves. That's the heart, in some ways, of the Jungian interpretation of depth psychological alchemy. And we've already talked about the general practice of externalization. This is something to consider, and seriously, think about things like Marwin Call. Really think about it. Right? Think about what's happening there, and think about what's happening generally in cases of projection. Really think about it. Okay. So much of my work around this came out of this suggestion I made a long time ago that projecting onto chemistry set experiments seemed interesting in some ways, right? It's sort of predictable, but how much more powerful would it be to project onto a narrative substrate? That is to say, onto a substrate which itself obeys the same kinds of rules as the psyche obeys. Now, we obviously already do this in art routinely, but the proposal I want to make around what I call narrative alchemy, okay, is that role-playing offers a completely unique substrate relative to other art forms for doing so, because it is an entirely responsive narrative substrate. Right? It's not static. It's as responsive as the person who is interpreting and working in the game in a very therapeutic kind of capacity above and beyond role-playing, right? There is a reflective and an elaborative kind of capacity there. So, part of the argument that I want to make here is that, in a certain sense, this kind of narrative alchemy that I'm talking about, instantiated through things like role-playing practice, represent almost a uniquely powerful tool for doing this kind of work. Now, obviously, this is why I'm writing a book about it and about other things. But, this is why a bunch of my, sort of theoretical work is there and my practical work is there because, role-playing games have only been around formally for about 50 years. They're a surprisingly new invention, right? In the rules-mediated sense, right? As opposed to the just let's play pretend sense. And thus, we're really, as an art form, only beginning to see the first openings and flowerings. It's all early days for this as an actual art form. We're still discovering the internal grammar and the critical language around it. This is quite contentious. And the theory is woefully underdeveloped, in my opinion. Although it's now starting to get academic attention as the field becomes much bigger. Certainly way bigger than it was when I started playing 37 years ago. So yeah, I'll leave you with that idea from the Jungian perspective, and just consider that stuff. I had a client say to me the other day, not a gamer, but somebody who knows my work, say, therapy is Dungeons and Dragons, he said to me. And he said, no, really, it is. Dungeons and Dragons is therapy. And this is not a guy who's really played. This kind of came out of nowhere. It sort of surprised me. And he was like, think about it. I mean, you're going down, you're encountering your demons, right? You're trying to bring back the treasure and you're trying to save the land. And it's true. There is an aspect to Dungeons and Dragons that, in its sort of simple formal sense, a group of adventurers, friends, band together with a variety of skills to descend into the dungeon, the underworld, fight monsters, avoid death traps, and seek a certain kind of treasure so that they can deliver the, personal wealth in some cases, but a lot of the time so that they can, save the princess, slay the dragon, save civilization. It is an enactive, narrative, ritual method of running through that. And let me add my very last comment, which is the massive boom of popularity around these games, and Dungeons and Dragons in particular, in the last 5 years, tells me that the archetype of the hero and the hero's journey isn't dead.